Hey, what's going on, everybody? So in this section, we're going to talk about budget. So at this part of the course, what you're going to do is you're going to be able to figure out the budget of your prospect. So this is going to be extremely valuable because you want to understand their budget, meaning if you understand how much they have or how much they're willing to spend for your product or service, then you could price your product appropriately. Now, this is going to be very effective for anyone who's doing any type of B2B sales because you're going to always adjust your price depending on what your client or customer needs. Sometimes you do have set prices and they're just hardcore, just not going to change, and that's fine. However, and a lot of times in business deals, you can always work out a deal because in negotiations, sometimes you give a little to get a little, and sometimes you got to work out what that price will be. Now, the other advantage of knowing price ahead of time is that if you understand another person's budget, you can actually increase your prices to match their budget, and you would actually make more money than you would have. You're not necessarily ripping somebody off. What you're doing is you're providing value and you're understanding how much they're willing to pay for that value, and you're going to charge them appropriately. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you guys about is, let's say if a customer doesn't have any money for your product or service, how can you expect them to pay you? They just can't, right? So that's why understanding someone's budget is incredibly important, because you need to know if they have the money. If they don't have the money, then you need to figure out when they will have the money. And if they're just never going to have the money, then you're wasting your time and you're wasting their time. Now, the thing about the budget part, right? This is especially true for entrepreneurs who are just learning sales for the first time, or anyone who's just learning sales for the first time, as a matter of fact, is that people in general are just afraid to talk about money. Nobody likes to tell the other person how much money they make, how much money they save, and things like that, because there's this negative stigma in cultures all around the world where people just don't want to talk about money, right? And people a lot of times believe that it's rude to talk about money or to ask how much money somebody has or how much they make and things like that. But the thing is, when it comes to sales, and if you're trying to get someone to buy your product or service, you need to make sure that the customer has some type of budget to be able to afford what you're offering. Now, if you do not know if they have a budget, you can spend days or a lot of hours, a lot of days, a lot of months and years possibly trying to convince this person to buy. But in the end, if you realize that they never even had the money to begin with, then it was a complete waste of time. So that's why usually on the first call, you need to make sure a person has some type of budget. You don't necessarily have to figure out to the detail how much budget they have. You just need some type of range, and you need to be confident that at the end of the sales cycle, they are going to buy your product or service, or they're going to be able to afford it at least. So here is how you are going to transition into the budget part of your sales cycle. So when you are in a sales meeting, right, you are listening to a person's pains, you're controlling the conversations through smart questions. And then when you want to transition into budget, right, meaning you're going from asking questions about pain to getting their budget, all you got to do is you want to first summarize all the major pain points that you got, right? And you just want to make sure that you get at least 3 to 5 critical pain points. And then when you're summarizing these pain points, what you want to do is you want to widen the gap as far as possible between their current situation, where they currently are, and their ideal situation, where they want to be. So once you do that and you summarize all these pain points, then you have earned the right to move on to the next phase, which is to ask the budget. Now, the question people have is, well, how do you exactly ask for someone's budget? And so I'm going to give you a couple examples that you can use, and then you can kind of tailor them, change them up for your product or service and your industry. So let's say you summarize all these pain points, they understand their ideal situation, and they understand where they want to go, okay? Now you're going to ask the budget question, and I call this one called the soft budget question. So it's basically just like kind of softly, subtly throwing it in there, and that's like saying, hey, John, have you thought about how much you'll need to invest to make this happen? And John's going to reply something like, well, I haven't thought about it, but maybe between $1,000 and $2,000, he might give you a range or something like that. Another example is, hey, Sally, I was just curious, is this something you've already set aside a budget for? And Sally might say, yeah, I actually did set aside a budget. And then you can say something like, well, since you did set aside a budget, is there a range of how much we're working with here? And Sally's going to say, oh, $5,000 to $10,000 was what I was thinking about, right? And another example is, any idea how much you're looking to spend to make XYZ happen, Jim? And Jim's going to be like, well, I was looking to spend $10,000 to, buy XYZ or get this thing done. And you could be like, okay, well, thanks for sharing me that. And then you continue on with the conversation. So as you can see here, the soft budget questions, it's really just a light, subtle way to ask a question without being too harsh. You're not necessarily saying like, hey, tell me your budget or how much money do you have? You're just saying like, hey, you've been talking for a little bit and I was just curious to know how much are you willing to invest to make this happen. Or if you ask nice enough and your tonality is right and that you build that rapport, then people are willing to tell you their budget. If they're not willing to tell you the exact budget right off the bat, you can get a range. And this is when we get into ballparking, meaning when I say ballpark, that's like, what is the general area for your budget? And these are some ballparking examples. So you could say, hey, Wilson, if we were to give you a range of what you were looking to invest in solving this problem, what would that look like? So you're basically just saying like, hey, what's the range that we're working with? And they're going to say, 10 to 20,000 or whatever it is. Another example is, hey, Wilson, usually when we work on projects like this, the total investment lands somewhere between $10,000 to $20,000. How does that fit within your budget? And as you can see here, I'm straight up just asking this person's budget, but in a way where I'm giving him a range. So I'm not saying what is your exact budget to the dollar, right? Because people feel very uncomfortable when you say that. But if you give them a range and give them flexibility, they feel like they're in control and they are controlling how much information they're giving you. However, the interesting part is because you're using this ballparking question formula, you are actually in control while making the other person feel like they are in control. And the last technique we're going to have when it comes to asking for someone's budget is when you reference. And that means you are referencing something in the past. Maybe it's a client you work with, or maybe it's something like, how much money they spent, a couple years ago on something similar. So an example would be, John, usually when I work with clients like yours, they'll usually have a monthly budget set aside for digital marketing. I was curious to know if this was something you already thought about too. And John might say, yeah, that makes sense. We do have a monthly budget. It's about $3,000 to $5,000. We're not sure yet, blah, 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 blah. And you continue the conversation. So the point of asking the budget is if John says $3,000 to $5,000 and you just happen to have a digital marketing service that costs about $5,000, then you can know that you can try to charge John $5,000 because he has the money for it. Now, if your service is $10,000, you can kind of pause the conversation right there and say, hey, look, John, typically when we're doing something like this, the range we're working with is between $10,000 to $15,000. It seems like you only have $3,000 to $5,000. So I'm not sure if it makes sense to work together. What do you think? And then John will be like, well, we can raise the budget, or John might say, we can't do that. And so right away, you know that if the person doesn't have money for your product or service, then it's not a good fit. Then you kind of end the call right there and move on to the next prospect. So if someone doesn't have the budget and they're not going to get the budget in the future, then it just doesn't make sense to talk with them. And it doesn't make sense to sell them something that they can't afford, right? In other cases, maybe they just haven't really thought about how much they need to afford whatever it is you have. And sometimes they need more time to figure out how to increase their budget. And that's totally fine. And it'll just take a little bit longer. So the reason why asking for the budget and understand your customer's budget is because you need to make sure that they can afford whatever it is that you have so that you could price your product or service appropriately. Okay, so one more example, and I'm going to use referencing again, and let's go ahead and go in. Sarah, I was working with a client a couple weeks ago who was experiencing the same exact challenge you were. They invested close to $10,000 to solve their issues. Would investing $10,000 something you would invest if you felt confident we could take care of this for you? And from there, Sarah might say, yeah, I would if you can solve my problem. $10,000 seems like a steal. Or Sarah might say, that's a little bit out of my budget. Then you can ask questions like, well, typically we do charge $10,000, but how do you think we can make this work, Sarah? Right? So you're kind of reversing it and you're making Sarah give you the solution to this problem. Whether someone has the budget or they don't have the budget, you want to then continue to ask questions to really get down to the bottom of it, and whether or not you need to decrease your price or whether the other person can figure out how to get the funds, right? So every business is different. So every solution is going to be different. And that's why you need to ask these budget questions to get down to the truth and exactly how much money they have, what's their range you're working with, and whether or not you feel that you want to work with them depending on the size of their budget. So with that said, that's everything you need to cover when it comes to understanding budget. You just want to have a couple ways where you can ask for the budget in different subtle ways that doesn't make the other person feel comfortable. And then from there, you can kind of move forward with the sales meeting. So with that said, again, everything we get to cover when it comes to budgeting, and I will see you in the next section.